Housekeeping notes.
Had a little trouble finding the button.
Welcome all. Let me start again. I'm Rick Weston. Welcome to the meeting of the Clean Heat Technical Advisory Group, May 30th, 2024. I'd like to start with a few housekeeping notes, Freudian, obviously. Folks, please stay muted unless you are called on to speak. And also, it helps that only the tag members keep their video on during the meeting. When other folks who are not members of the tag speak, turn on their video, please. But we prefer that we keep just have only the video of the tag members on during the meeting. I am hoping at the moment that the chair of and he is, want to start before we go over to the consent agenda and the minutes. I'd like to start by introducing Chair Ed McNamara of the Vermont PUC, who has a few words he'd like to say to the group. So Ed, if you can unmute yourself, it'd be great.
Great, thanks, Rick. Yeah, thanks for having me here this morning. I do want to first start by thanking everyone for all the work that they're doing on this. This is difficult, complicated stuff, and digging in like this, all the volunteer work, I very much appreciate everything everyone's doing. It's important that we get the thermal sector right to meet GWSA requirements, our obligations, and all the work that you're doing is feeding directly into this. It's going to be extremely helpful for the clarity and so that we can understand what exactly Clean Heat Standard is requiring, what the technical aspects are. So appreciate all the work that you're doing. I'm going to be sitting in, listening in today, but I'm going to be mostly keeping my mouth shut because this is not my role. This is Rick sort of leading you folks through this and talking through the technical issues. I'm here to try to understand and get a better sense of what's going on. So thank you again for having me here.
Great, Ed. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Okay. Let me start by going over the agenda. I'd like the consent of the group to make some changes to the agenda. Essentially, they are just reallocation of some time. We want to extend the time for our upcoming GREET mini workshop from 1 hour to an hour and a half as needed. We can squeeze some time out of the emissions profile discussion that will be very short. And we also will shorten the equity advisory group, I believe, discussion, and the breakout group discussions is where we'll really shorten the time, about 15 minutes. If that's all right with folks, I'd like to do that. Is any discussion or opposition to that? Okay, great. Much appreciated. I hope folks had a chance to review the minutes from our last meeting. And if so, would anyone like to make a motion to approve those minutes?
So moved.
By Brian. We don't need a second. All in favor, signify by raising your hand, or actually raising that hand. That looks like a
People are looking for their hand.
You got it. Okay. Great. All opposed? Lower our hands. Yeah. Okay, great. We're good. Thank you. The minutes are approved. Much appreciated. With that, I'll turn to Dominic from the Public Utility Commission. Deirdre is not able to join us today, but Dominic has kindly offered to step in and give us an update.
Do you want to just acknowledge the alternates? We've got quite
Oh.
a few alternates that are stepping in on behalf of the tag or along with the tag members.
That's true. There are a number of alternates. Corey Ann Wynn, you're sitting in for Floyd, I gather. Matthew is here, Matthew Bakerpool, until TJ arrives. Who else?
And we have the experts for Efficiency Vermont and for NESCOM.
Oh, that's correct.
Oh, TJ's here too.
And TJ's just arrived. Yes, for Vermont, you said Vermont, we've got, do you mean VEIC?
Yeah, Efficiency Vermont. So
Emily, you want to remind us who is here for you?
Yeah, we'll have Haley Rowe from Efficiency Vermont for the pacing breakout group, Adam Sherman for the bioenergy group. Dave will not be joining us today, and Ben Plotzker will be here with anything that relates to TRM work. Thanks, Rick.
Great. Thank you. And Emily Levin?
Yeah, we've got Dr. Cullen Word here with us. Some of you may have reviewed the comments that he previously provided, but he's here on behalf of NESCOM as somebody with expertise in bioenergy to contribute to that portion of the discussion and participate in the bioenergy work group on behalf of NESCOM while I attend the pacing work group. So really glad to have him here. If it's useful, I could provide a little more information on his background. I don't know if that's necessary.
I don't think so at this point. Let's, and again, let me remind folks, keep your video off if you're not a member of the tag, and except when you're speaking. Okay. Great. Well then, now I'll turn to Dominic for updates from the PUC.
I'm glad we've got that ready to go. Like was mentioned, Deirdre is out today, so I am filling in with some updates from the PUC and will be around to answer any questions that come my way. 3 things I wanted to mention. The first is S305, which is the PUC housekeeping bill and also has some CHS provisions specifically related to the DDA appointment timeline. That was transmitted from the legislature to the governor on Friday the 24th. So today is the 5th relevant day. So we're expecting action from the governor today on S305. I've got his legislative blog open and we'll let people know if things change during the meeting. The second thing I wanted to mention was there were some minor updates made to the plain language overview that was produced by the PUC as a more accessible explanation of what the clean heat standard is and relevant pieces. Some administrative changes, and then there was a update on the what will CHS cost section, and we added a section to give people an idea of what the low income and medium income cutoffs will be. So that is on the right-hand side of the website if people want to take a look at that or use it in any of your work. Then the last thing I wanted to talk about was the pacing straw proposal that was issued this morning in 23-2220-rule. Comments from the public or participants in the case are going to be due June 20th. The commission expects the pacing subgroup of TAG to take the lead in developing TAG's review and response. The thought is that the pacing subgroup will prepare written comments in response to the proposal, sharing those with the full TAG at the TAG's next meeting on June 13th. TAG members will then have June 13th meeting to ask questions and form their positions around the issues. And then the idea is TAG will be prepared to vote on written comments to send to the PUC as a group the following meeting on 6/27. So that pacing proposal is out this morning. We are very much looking forward to this group, both as a whole and as individuals engaging on this topic. We're getting real into the weeds, and this is where the commission's thinking is right now. And any issues that people see, we're looking forward to your constructive ideas on how we can make it even better. I did see a check come through that the comments are due June 19th. Sorry, just misspoke on my part. So comments from the public are due June 19th.
Great. Thank you very much, Dominic. And Michelle, you and your group are gonna have your work cut out for you. I've already had a chance to review the straw proposal, and so I'm looking forward to digging into that. Thank you very much, Dominic. Any questions for Dominic? Emily?
Sorry for not finding the hand raise. Do you have any update on timing for or process to fill the vacancy? I know the PUC did issue an invitation for people that wanted to apply to join the tag.
I do not. That was something that Deirdre is lead on, and I did not get an update on for this meeting. My apologies.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Well, with that, let's move on to our next item. Our mini workshop, as we're calling it, on modeling, on GREET, on life cycle analysis and the questions and challenges there. The point of this workshop is really to educate the TAG members who are not well versed in modeling and in GREET about the issues, where the analytical challenges lie, and to identify, to bring to the surface different perspectives and assumptions about the modeling for determining life cycle emissions. The bioenergy subgroup, of course, has been taking the lead on these questions and will continue to do so and pick up on this discussion later in the breakout part of the meeting today, and of course, continuing after. This is, as I say, this is pedagogical. This is for really beginning to having the TAG begin to learn and really understand where some of the real challenges and issues lie. Obviously, we are going to be digging into these and really trying to resolve them for ourselves once we see the output from Opinion Dynamics, the PUC's consultant on measure characterization. So for today, let's hear what people have to say and learn as much as we can. We're going to start with a report from ANR and its consultant ERG, who did the recent work on life cycle analysis for upstream emissions accounting. The report that was shared a little while back. I hope you all had a chance to read it. We'll start with that, and then we'll give a little bit of time for Q&A, clarifying questions. Again, we'll dig into the issues more with our background and key assumptions on biomass and biofuels discussion, which will begin with a framing presentation by Emily Levin, and we've reserved about an hour for that. So with that, let me turn, I think, to Brian and Colin Smythe and take it away. Much appreciated.
I'm going to turn right over to Colin.
All right.
See, Colin.
All right. Thank you. I'm Colin Smythe from the HSTM Natural Resources Climate Action Office. And I'm really going to turn it over pretty quickly to our consultant, but wanted to hand it over to them to kind of give an update on the Vermont energy sector life cycle assessment report that they completed, and ERG, Eastern Research Group, was our contractor for that, and they are essentially done with that project now. We're just in the very final stages of wrapping that up, but Ben Young and Andrew Beck are here from ERG to kind of give you all a brief overview of that project anyway, and hopefully answer some questions about that for you all. So Ben, if you want to take it away, that would be great.
Ben, before you do, just one quick question, and I'll put to Colin, or maybe Ben, you'll be answering, just to kick it off. A simple question, which I assume your presentation is intended to answer, but what was the purpose of the work? What were you trying to do?
That's a great question, and yeah, I think slide number 2 gets right at that. So happy to jump into that. Let me make sure I can share my screen here.
You
before
should
I
be able
turn
to. Here you go. Great.
Well, great. Well, thank you, Colin and Brian, and thanks everyone. Glad to be here to give you a relatively quick overview of the work that we did and the purpose of this work that we performed for ANR over the past year and a half or so. So I'm Ben Young. I'm a life cycle analyst at Eastern Research Group. My colleague Andrew Beck is also on the line, another life cycle analyst, sort of representatives from our small team. So I'm happy to be here. Like I said, I'm going to go through relatively quickly just to give you a quick overview. I understand you've seen the report, so want to frame what we did, talk about briefly how it might be relevant to you all and how it might not be relevant, and what we use, because we also relied on the GREET model. So I think that's where where this discussion is going today, but I know we don't have a lot of time. So apologies in advance if we rush through things or don't get all the clarity you need, at least in the first pass. Yeah, so here was our purpose when it came to this work for ANR. We wanted to do, try to do some life cycle accounting for the energy system for fuels consumed in Vermont. So really, this was meant to be a supplement to the state's greenhouse gas inventory, which traditionally has been a territorial inventory that focused on emissions that occur within the state. But we know that, especially for the fuels that are consumed in the state, really for a lot of the materials and services consumed in the state, there are upstream emissions that occur outside of the state that are also that could be relevant. So the task here was, can we try to account for those? Can we understand what those emissions might be? What is, how do those upstream emissions compare to the total emissions profile of the state? How many emissions are we adding when we start looking outside of the borders? But we, importantly here, we did want to align with the state's current inventory approach. We wanted to develop emissions factors that represented the emissions upstream of what was going on in the state in a way that best aligned with the current approach of the inventory. So I think you've seen, we put together a report that described the methodology, documented some of the results of our approach, as well as we put together a workbook that contained what we called upstream emission factors. So those are going to be, in kilograms carbon dioxide equivalent per unit of fuel consumed. That would reflect, I'll get into the system boundaries or the here in a moment, but that would reflect, essentially the emissions, again, that aren't currently captured in the state's inventory that might be occurring outside of the state. So we did that. So we developed these emission factors. Then we also calculated with those emission factors, what are the total upstream emissions that we might want to add in addition to what Vermont is already capturing in their inventory. Again, just to be clear, Vermont already is assessing their emissions in state. We want to add what might not already be included in that, what's going on upstream or out of the state. And that also included, in this case, the emissions from imported electricity. So electricity that might be coming from Canada, that might be coming from the broader region, their emissions associated with the generation of that electricity. So I think this is where it starts to get relevant for you all. As one of our primary data sources used to assess those emission factors, we relied on Argonne National Lab's GREET model. It's a model that we use often in our work for life cycle assessment. It's a highly regarded model in the for US data. The benefit of GREET is that it does provide time series data, which is relevant in our work where we wanted to assess not just the emissions in 2020 or 2021 or 2022, but also ideally all the way back to cover the whole scope of Vermont's inventory. And then it's configurable. So we, in some cases where it was appropriate, we made some adjustments to the data or the assumptions in GREET to really reflect the conditions that we wanted to model for Vermont's energy system. GREET is something that's updated on a regular basis, typically every year. And just wanted to note that during the course of our work, we were using a version from 2022, and which has since been updated. And there might be a notable change that we might want to discuss here shortly. As we think about our work, one of the big challenges here was how can we define the boundaries of the emissions that we are trying to assess or characterize. Again, one of the key considerations was we don't want to double count emissions that might already be within the Vermont inventory. And so our goal was, how do we look upstream of what's already accounted for in the inventory? That might be, examples would include things like crude oil extraction that might be taking place in the US or internationally. Certainly natural gas extraction, coal where it's relevant, perhaps not so much anymore, but certainly earlier in the time series, as well as any biomass fuels that might be grown, harvested, or produced outside of the state boundaries. And we did take a life cycle approach. So that means we're not only just, we are trying to account for as much of the life cycle of these energy systems as we can. Just a quick overview of some of the pathways that we explored for this work. Some of the traditional fossil fuels, petroleum-based fuels that are being consumed. We also looked at renewable sources of electricity, hydroelectric, specifically hydroelectricity from Hydro-Quebec, as well as some more emerging fuels like RNG, and of course for Vermont, certainly emphasis on woody biomass. So I'm going to try to, again, we don't have a lot of time, going to sort of maybe quickly set the stage here for the kind of thing that we can do with GREET. Colin, certainly welcome you if these are things we should skip, or this is helpful. Certainly chime in if the context isn't quite right here. But just wanted to kind of give you an example of the kinds of things that we do with GREET that might be relevant here. These are some screenshots from the Excel model, but really what GREET is meant to do is it provides what we call unit process data, or specific data on points within the supply chain for these fuels. Things such as what is the energy use that's used for crude extraction? What is the what kind of fuels are being consumed during that extraction? How is that crude then transported to the refinery? What are the emissions that might come in both of those processes, the extraction, the transport, the refining stage? So these are all things that GREET takes into account when it attempts to calculate the emissions for any of the pathways that are covered within the model. Excuse me. And GREET does capture the primary greenhouse gas species, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, both combustion-based emissions that might take place, as well as any non-combustion emissions that are relevant for those gases. So we could certainly walk through, spend more time walking through specific cases for any of our pathways, but again, wanted to sort of, show what one of the outputs here is. We use the GREET model to try to develop emission factors per unit of energy consumed for each of our energy pathways across the time series. So whether, for example, the emissions from generating the infrastructure required for renewable resources, solar panels or wind turbines per unit of electricity generated, or when it comes to liquid fuels, the energy required to extract and process those fuels per unit of energy consumed. So this is one of the primary outputs of our work, was to generate this workbook of upstream emission factors. To be clear, again, because we were focused on additional emissions not covered in Vermont, these emission factors are not going to account for the combustion of these fuels in the state, whether in vehicles, in homes, in businesses. because that's already captured in the in-state inventory. So these, we call them upstream emission factors, but that was the focus of our work. Then we could take these emission factors and apply them to the estimates that Vermont has of the amount of motor gasoline consumed in vehicles, or the amount of natural gas consumed by industry, what have you, to calculate our total upstream emissions quantities. So I guess when we do a time check, we have two more slides here that get into some of the weeds of some of the specifics of RNG and woody biomass that might be relevant to this group, but I don't want to get into.
We've got about 12 minutes or so.
Okay.
So yeah, if you can take us through it, sure.
So this starts to get weedsy. Andrew, if you wanted to jump in to dig into some of these nuances of RNG and how GREET might handle renewable natural gas and woody biomass.
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. These topics on these next two slides are covered in our report, mostly in the RNG and biogenic carbon sections of the report, respectively. I wanted to start with the usage of counterfactual scenarios in GREET. And just to provide like a little more current background before I dive into the technical details here, California's the California Air Resources Board, CARB, is currently going through kind of like a review window for its implementation of GREET as the backend for their low carbon fuel standard. And there's a lot of very active discussion around how counterfactual scenarios and the avoided emissions credits that can be derived from them are implemented in GREET currently, and how folks trying to use GREET for regulatory purposes might think or rethink their applicability for their goals and the scope of what they are trying to characterize. So that being said, counterfactuals are kind of just like another name for a type of scenario that essentially says, if I do this, then this other thing will or will not happen. And it shares a lot of commonalities with approaches in LCA like substitution, if I produce two products from the same process. And one of them is my fuel that I care about, and another one is just kind of a smaller value-added co-product. Oftentimes in life cycle assessment, that secondary product will either be given some amount of credit for producing it because the practitioners assume that it is thereby not produced somewhere else in the supply chain or the economy, or you can allocate across those two products using attributes of the products, such as their mass, their energy, their economic value. Those two kind of like clusters of approaches are what are kind of traditionally sorted into these two bins that I have here on the slide: attributional and consequential life cycle assessment. So attributional life cycle assessment is entirely just saying this is the entire chunk of emissions that are occurring across the state or a region or the entire national economy. And we are trying to attribute which fractions of those emissions trace back to which activities. On the other hand, consequential life cycle assessment is trying to understand if I consume a marginal additional unit of some fuel, or if I incentivize the consumption of one fuel over another, what might the change in the total impact profile look like? And counterfactual scenarios are naturally kind of the part of the research question that is being asked in consequential life cycle assessment. And I'm really condensing here, and the details of why these different methods that I'm talking about kind of fit into these different frameworks is best described in a pretty recent National Academy's report on low carbon transport fuels. Chapter 3 of that, and I have a link in the slide here, but I can drop it in the chat as well. Chapter 3 of that report really goes into a lot of depth on how these methods have been used, how the lines between them have been somewhat blurred in the past, but how folks are starting to more clearly identify the purposes of each of these methods. So, and this is all background in order for me to say, inside of GREET, certain pathways do contain counterfactual scenarios, whether they are individual stages in the life cycle that are separated, or whether they're baked straight into the results of a given stage. So in the case of landfill renewable natural gas in GREET, as we were working through it, we kind of noticed that, oh, there's a separate stage that provides an emissions credit for avoiding the flaring of landfill gas and instead capturing it to be later combusted. That avoided flaring emission, which again is like a negative CO2 equivalent flow, is one of these counterfactuals, and the justification for this type of scenario is often like, if you didn't capture it and burn it, it would naturally be flared. And the justification for those scenarios often relies on kind of like, what is the status quo, or what has been the status quo versus what are people trying to do or trying to change about these activities. And again, that's kind of just a consequential question. It doesn't necessarily help you divvy up the emissions and attribute them to the actual activities. And it also, it's not every pathway contains these, and not every alternative product, not every other source of renewable natural gas is using the same type of scenarios attached to these pathways. And this is kind of one of the key sources of discrepancies in how the emissions factors are put together in GREET. And even more significantly in the animal waste RNG pathway, not even in a separate stage, but baked straight into one of the stages, there are carbon sequestration credits given for applying the residues derived from anaerobic digestion to farmland or just to soil. Those aren't necessarily, it basically assumes permanent sequestration of that carbon. That isn't really backed up by literature, or there's other studies that suggest, depending on farming practices, that carbon can be re-emitted. The counterfactual scenarios in GREET are not always necessarily sophisticated. And again, for the sake of like regulatory purposes, often attributional approaches are more appropriate, because attributional approaches also have a convenient characteristic in that they essentially guarantee the additivity of results. If you're not incorporating any counterfactuals or avoided emissions credits, you are always attributing slices of the same big pie to all of these activities. And whenever you add those slices up, they add up to the total emissions within a given defined boundary. And that is why, we've seen the emergence of these things called product category rules, PCRs. Those are essentially just standardized allocation schemes, attribution schemes for evaluating the carbon intensity of different products. And yeah, this is kind of the big scary stuff in the back end of GREET right now. This is the thing that everybody is arguing about in California. And in California in particular, animal waste, renewable natural gas is getting a lot of attention because the carbon intensities are extremely negative right now, like in the negative, like hundreds of grams of carbon per, I forget what the basis is. I don't know if it's megajoule or BTU or something, but it's, yeah, those negative carbon intensities around animal waste are essentially entirely derived from these avoided emissions credits coming from the counterfactuals baked into GREET. And California is looking at whether they should be stripping those out. In the case of our work, we actually did preemptively strip these things out. We did not include the avoided emissions credits in our results because, again, they don't really align with the scope of the work that we were trying to perform, which is to attach these upstream emissions factors to the consumption of energy commodities within Vermont. Whether, you know, a landfill in New York did or didn't flare a marginal unit of methane is not necessarily, it's not really relevant to the question of what are the total upstream carbon emissions associated with delivering this commodity to Vermont. I feel like I should pause after this for questions, but okay, yeah, thank you for clicking, Ben. The other thing that came up during the course of our work is that we started, you know, working with the 2022 revision 1 version of GREET back in 2023. The 2023 version of GREET released, I think, in April of this year. And funnily enough, all these things that we had been doing to remove the counterfactual emissions credits was then kind of embedded, like a disclaimer was embedded in the latest version of GREET that essentially says you should really think carefully about whether these are appropriate for the study that you're trying to perform, in fewer words. Yeah, so the folks at Argonne who maintain GREET are aware of these problems, are aware that they need to probably instantiate more parameters at the tops of their tabs in order for people to have very explicit finer grained control over these assumptions. But currently, you kind of have to go through manually in order to remove them if they are not suitable for your purposes. Okay, this is a good place to pause for questions, I think.
Well, before you do you have more slides?
I have one more on biogenic carbon, yes.
I would suggest doing that first, and then we'll go to questions.
Okay.
And then we'll have Sam and Patrick.
Yeah. So GREET 1 contains 2 tabs related to woody biomass, energy commodities. One of them is the woody tab, which is essentially trying to characterize the uptake and harvest of biogenic carbon from short rotation woody crops in particular. GREET has focused a lot on the shorter rotation crops because they are, they've been viewed as promising precursors to biofuels, whether it's through torrefaction and pyrolysis. And they are also the things that plug into pellet production. You know, a lot of the short rotation woody crops grown in the southeast of the US are harvested and pelletized and shipped over to different European countries for electricity generation. For those reasons and other reasons I probably don't understand, most of the biogenic carbon modeling that happens inside of GREET is focused on short rotation woody crops. It also uses a stand level carbon accounting approach, which is to say it looks at harvest of an individual tree and then regrowth of an individual tree, and then it just adds a bunch of trees together in order to form a stand. That harvest followed by regrowth assumption, and I'm going to stick with calling it an assumption, is one of the fundamental issues that underpins the choices of temporal scopes in life cycle assessment work that's happened in the past. That choice of whether to put harvest first or tree growth first in the temporal scope is a pretty severe source of discrepancies across studies. And it's just kind of naturally an arbitrary decision that a lot of practitioners have tried to make. There are, thankfully, a collection of newer papers that address just how many problems that causes and ways to completely avoid it. Peñalosa 2019 does a good job at identifying the actual quantitative implications of choosing this temporal scope for biogenic carbon. And then those next two papers, Cowie et al. Is 2021 is a review paper that talks about this temporal problem in addition to other common problems in trying to study biogenic carbon. And it essentially advocates for using landscape scale assessments, which is to say integrated assessment models that are operating on larger swaths of forest land. Essentially, you want to take a unit of forested land that is under a standard uniform management regime, set of management practices, and you can ultimately kind of treat that like a production facility and look at the equilibrium levels of carbon stored on that parcel or that region. And depending on how the equilibrium shifts over time, depending on other types of scenario modeling that you could perform, you can then say what the carbon intensity of woody products coming from that area are. And finally, the last paper here is just a pointer to a study that I think does a particularly good job at that and has a few co-authors on it that also, I believe, worked on some stuff in Vermont. Yeah, it's a mixture. It's mostly Canadian folks on that paper, but they have collaborated with U.S. Forest Service and other life cycle assessment researchers in the United States. There's one final click here, Ben. This is just a diagram from the Penaloza paper talking about what happens when you choose these different temporal boundaries. So setup one here is just if you choose harvest and then regrowth. So you see the carbon intensity per, and this is passenger car kilometer, but this is taking these a woody biomass product, turning it into butanol and using that as a transportation fuel. So, you can think of this chart as per, I don't know if it's megajoule per energy unit of butanol or per mass unit of woody biomass. So it starts high and drops off whenever you harvest first, and then regrowth happens as carbon is being sequestered. That line, that intensity, that overall life cycle intensity over a given time horizon comes back down. In the second setup, if you grow your woody biomass crop first and then harvest it, you notice that there's like a little bump. I think that's just based on like site preparation and maybe some other pre-harvest activities. And then you see the sequestration as the line comes down. And then during harvest at year 0, it jumps back up and kind of like tails off in this logarithmic way. That is based on just kind of the slow decay of like incomplete combustion byproducts in the atmosphere. Setup 3, landscape spatial boundaries. There's essentially a static amount of implied carbon intensity, and as you see, as we go from landscape to national, assuming a natural regeneration baseline, these things also shift. And yeah, this is all just to say biogenic carbon is quite complicated, and yeah, it's a pretty active area of research.
Well, thank you, Andrew. And thank you,
Yeah.
Ben. Is that, have you got through all your slides?
Yes.
Well, we've gone a little bit longer, but we want to take some clarifying questions. And we really appreciate, by the way, your time for us today. So thank you very much. Start with Sam and then we'll go to Patrick.
Thanks, Rick, and thanks, Andrew. I thought that was a really helpful presentation. I think you did a good job explaining how counterfactual scenarios work and going over some of the existing material from California and other places. I wanted to clarify, so I think just a couple questions. First, when we're talking about counterfactual scenarios, you mentioned that they're sort of based on the status quo, right? My understanding is that they're actually based on regulatory baselines, right? So landfills that are required to flare their gas receive that as the baseline for the counterfactual. Farms that are not required to cap their methane emitting manure ponds also use that as the counterfactual. Would you be able to clarify, am I wrong about that?
There's a lot of different versions of GREET. What is called the R&D version of GREET, which is kind of the most recent set of updates that the team that maintains it adds to it every year. That's changing all the time, and it might reflect different types of status quos. But I do think the regulatory versions of GREET, the ones that are peeled off from the R&D version, saved from a given year and tailorized for regulatory applications, are probably closer to what you're describing. Like they're probably thinking about their counterfactuals as relative to a regulated baseline. It does still kind of like run into the same methodological questions as I mentioned with that diagram between attributional and consequential approaches.
Okay, thanks. That's helpful. And so I think to clarify for the group, right, the places that are using the model currently in state regulations are doing so based on the regulatory baseline. So that's landfills, flaring, or, methane emitting organics emitting methane. I think that's important, right? Because the point of the avoided emissions crediting is to be able to work as a tool to reduce those methane emissions. And I think, that's how our industry plays an important role in a lot of ways.
Sam, did you have another clarifying question?
Yeah, I do. So clarifying first, another thing here, right? So yes, there's a lot of discussion around this in California. I don't think they're planning to change avoided methane crediting until the 2040s. I was wondering if, Andrew, if you had any additional information on there. I know you mentioned the discussion at CARB and in California, but they do have a timeline for that, and that's 2040s, right? So in other words, they're not actually planning to change that really in the near term.
I haven't dug that far into what's going on in the docket over there.
We don't have any real insight into California process other than like just tracking as interested observers. So I don't want to speak for their process. I don't think we should be doing that. So
okay, thank you. And my one other question was, you mentioned that the CI scores for the methane avoidance in the dairy sector especially are extremely negative. And so, we know that calculation is based on the fact that methane is 86 times as potent as CO2. Do you guys have a reason to believe that that's an incorrect calculation from Argonne, or has there been any discussion around, whether or not that highly negative carbon intensity score is calculated incorrectly? Like is there a reason why we shouldn't believe that that's right?
Again, I think Andrew's point was just that these counterfactuals can be really the decision is really important because they can have implications, that can lead to pretty wide, pretty substantially different carbon intensities. Again, I don't think that we're trying to suggest that California's approach is inappropriate or something. They certainly spend a lot of time, and again, we're not trying to get into the weeds on what California's done. That's certainly not our role here, but just that these is an important decision that the group here and who else is involved in this process will need to consider.
I will say if you want to kind of like hold in your mind both the attributional and the consequential ways to conceive of RNG from animal waste, there's a lot of different ways to perform this kind of like consequential set of like scenario analyses that might be, are we helping to move away from methane emissions in these different ways? Regulatory baselines don't always reflect like the common practices of farmers. Some farmers might already be abating these things in certain ways. But aside from scenario modeling, just pure attributional thinking, the manure produced by livestock and then digesting it into biogas, that product can still be viewed as a co-product of raising livestock in the same way that hides can, in the same way that many other parts of a cow can be viewed as co-products of raising a cow. And asserting that because we take this manure and digest it and turn it into methane and then burn that, is naturally like preventing other bad things from happening, is essentially saying that we have no alternative but to raise this cow and do this. It doesn't look at the counterfactual of what if you didn't raise an entire marginal cow in the first place. So there's like a really selective application of counterfactuals happening already. And if you were actually trying to divvy up the whole pile of emissions that happen, I do think that you would probably veer more toward an attributional lens.
Thanks, Andrew. And if I can just add one thing,
Okay, Sam.
in response, I think that's a great explanation. Just want to be clear that, you know, the AD industry is responsible for 86% of methane reductions to date in California because of the avoided methane crediting and other incentives that they have for these technologies. So other than getting rid of the farms, it seems that that is actually working, whether it's, you know, philosophically in 2040 or whenever we draw that line, whether it's the best solution.
Thanks, Sam. I think we want to save any further discussion until the later part of this session where we have specific questions we're teeing up for discussion. Patrick, do you have a question?
Yeah, maybe if you could just clarify, Catherine, what you just said. I have several questions. There's also lots of clarification I'd like to provide to the TAG members so that they, who are not experts on some of these things, can have more context.
Yeah, we have set aside a whole hour for the discussion of some of these assumptions and what people's perspectives are on them. So I would ask that you just hold those until we get there.
Okay.
But if you do have a question for understanding what was presented, then we could cover that now.
Sure. First is just, can you guys thank you so much, and especially walking through the attributional consequential discussion is complicated, and really appreciate it. So second simple question is just, can you share slides with all of us, because they're helpful, and but wanted to see if you can put your slides back up and go back to the list of emissions factors. I didn't see that in your report, and just I had a question about it.
So I'm not sure who is off mute that is causing the background noise, but if everybody who is not speaking could go on mute, that would be very helpful.
All right, can you see, Patrick?
Yes, thank you. So, yeah, I noted when it went by before how high the RNG emissions factors are. And I note in your report that, like in the final tab of your report, that I haven't read the whole report yet, that from RNG that there are no upstream emissions by sector in your Appendix B, but your emissions factors for RNG are, at least RNG or farm, highest here. I think the reason for that is, at least in electricity, I think the reason it's the highest is because you said you excluded some of those counterfactuals because that's what your purpose was. But can you help me? Clarification, like, if RNG emissions factors are that high, then why in your report is it just showing values of 0 or emissions from RNG?
So I think what you're describing is that, like, when we account for the quantity of RNG that's consumed within the state relative to other fuels, the total emissions that stem from RNG consumption upstream are low, just because of the quantity is small. So I think that's, if I'm understanding correctly, the question.
Great, thank you. That makes sense. And this is just sort of my curiosity here, but about in relation to hydro, I see the reservoir is quite high in relation to the run-of river. And I'm wondering if you know why that is. Is that because creating a reservoir creates anaerobic activity that's accounted for? If you don't know, it's not too big of a deal. Mostly was just.
Yeah, I believe for the reservoir we would have accounted for methane emissions from the reservoir over time. Trying to think back to all the details of each pathway off the top of my head, but I think that's the case.
Sure. Thank you. So yeah, just getting those slides would be really helpful because this was really helpful. Thank you.
Great.
Yeah,
Thanks. Thank you, Patrick.
There's also, just super quick, there's an Excel workbook that we put together that has all these calculations in it and traces all the way back to the GREET model, or the copy of GREET 1 that we tailorized for Vermont's context. That kind of bridge, the workbook that this view comes from might also be something, I don't know, Colin, if you're able to share it, it could be valuable. But yeah, that just has kind of stage by stage how these factors are aggregated into what you see here.
Great. Thank you very much, Ben and Andrew. This is really helpful. We really appreciate it. Feel free to stay on and listen to our discussion if you wish, if you've got the time. I know you're busy. Colin, thank you very much, and Brian as well. I'm now going to turn our discussion over to Catherine to facilitate. We're going to begin with a short, quick, I hope, presentation on these issues to frame the discussion, to set up some of the questions and answers, well, the discussion that we've already headed into, to further illuminate and elucidate the issues for us. Again, we're not making any decisions today, but we do want to understand where the issues lie. So with that, Catherine, I'll turn it to you. Thank you very much.
And I think it's
Again,
really, Emily needs to pick it up from here. She has some slides to share that'll help structure this conversation, get us through some of the key points that are being raised. Emily, you have the capacity to share your screen. There you go.
Sorry, just looking for the unmute button. Yeah, that was a really helpful presentation. Are you seeing an agenda slide? I can't quite see what you all are seeing. Yeah, what we were thinking in terms of moving through this conversation as a tag, that we just wanted to make sure, I know some tag members are very steeped in these issues, but for others of us, we are a little newer to the issues, and we just wanted to kind of take these issues point by point. So I've got some slides, but they're really just intended to frame a discussion. So we'll go through a couple slides and then we'll kind of pause and talk about it. Again, not with the intention of actually arriving at a decision, but just surfacing the range of issues and views and questions that we have as a group, and hopefully identifying some areas for the bioenergy subgroup to dig into a little further. The first couple of slides are really just making sure we all have a common understanding of the Vermont greenhouse gas inventory versus the life cycle methodology in the Vermont Clean Heat Standard. So I'm actually going to turn it over to Colin Smythe from ANR to walk through these first two slides before we move into GREET, because that sort of speaks to why these questions are important and that there is this kind of reconciliation issue between the two methods. So Colin, if you can come on, I'll move my slides and just have you speak to the next couple.
Sure. Thanks, Emily. So I will try to make this very brief, and happy to answer questions on any of these, but just a very kind of high level overview of kind of what the inventory is. So it's a total kind of in boundary Vermont quantification of all the anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions emitted in the state. And the only kind of exception to that is the electricity sector, in which we do account for the generation component of electricity generated outside of the state borders, but not the upstream emissions associated with that, if that makes sense. So it's still not a life cycle value, but it is accounting for that generation that occurs outside of the borders. The inventory is required by state statute 10 VSA 582. And it relies on a lot of different data sets, and some of them large federal data sets, some of them more state-specific data sets. But it does lag several years because of that reliance on a couple of the large federal data sets at least. And it also utilizes tools from a lot of them from EPA, or it's really modules of the same state inventory tool or SIT tool. So I mentioned the lag. Currently, the inventory is from 1990 through 2020, and I am in the process of getting ready the 1990 to 2021 kind of as we speak. The methodologies are consistent and compatible with kind of the standard IPCC guidelines and are based on, I mentioned the SIT tool, which is kind of put out by EPA, but also the IPCC guidelines and a 2007 report that you'll see listed there. And it uses currently it uses 100-year global warming potentials from the AR4 report. We are going to be updating that in the next iteration to the 100-year AR5s. And we may do a sensitivity. I put one in the last inventory for a 20-year GWP values as well, but the official totals are going to be the 100-year. And I guess this kind of is more applicable for this group, but as kind of a note, really the important piece for the biogenic component here is that biogenic carbon dioxide is not accounted for within each individual sector in the inventory, and that's kind of an IPCC guideline, but instead is accounted for in the land use change, and forestry sector of the inventory, and based on kind of the sequestration and the carbon flux and land use change within the state annually. And so that I think is an important kind of component when discussing the biogenic CO2 just in general, just to keep in mind, I guess, and can have a lot more discussions on that. But yeah, and I guess the last point being that so although the land use change and forestry sector is in the inventory, the Global Warming Solutions Act actually references, or actually is specific to the gross emissions totals in the inventory, and so does not include any kind of sequestration or netting out of emissions by sequestration. And so that's again another kind of important component of that that will need to be considered when kind of linking up the clean heat standard and the inventory. Yeah, Emily, if you could jump to the next one. Thank you. So I mentioned a little bit of this already, but so the clean heat standard kind of reduction requirements, and I am not an expert on the clean heat standard, but have looked at it somewhat, certainly. It references the thermal sector of the inventory. There is not really a thermal sector in the inventory. It is the residential, commercial, and industrial fuel use sector, which is almost entirely thermal uses, but does include some kind of off-road diesel use. That may or may not be the case in the next iteration, but was the case previously just because of the default kind of federal level data set used and kind of the calculation framework in the APA tool. So we're looking at using some more granular tax data and potentially being able to break that out in the future, working on that right now. But getting back to kind of this discussion of connecting the two and touching on some of the material that ERG presented, is that the greenhouse gas inventory, as I mentioned, is an in-boundary inventory, and so does not account for kind of any of the other emissions associated with any of the fuels or any of the electricity. Well, I guess with my caveat on electricity, but outside of the state boundaries. So it doesn't have anything upstream in it unless that is captured like in another sector and happened in the state. So so that's kind of the main distinction is the boundary of the two. So the life cycle analysis, as was just described, it certainly the ERG, the life cycle analysis ERG completed was entirely upstream. As they mentioned, it was kind of done to supplement the inventory to provide a full kind of life cycle emissions picture by combining the two totals. And so those factors are exclusively upstream and not a full life cycle, and that was kind of the intention there. But life cycle analyses in general are going to capture kind of that whole, call it cradle to grave greenhouse gas emissions profile rather than the in-state boundary. And so I think that the trick is going to be trying to tie the two together, getting life cycle emissions reductions and tying it in to an in-boundary inventory value on which the Global Warming Solutions Act reduction levels are based, and also taking into account that biogenic carbon dioxide kind of potential difference in accounting, although I think that is, again, a decision that probably you all in the TAG will have to make on how that's handled for the clean heat measures. But that connection is going to be something that's going to warrant a lot of discussion, I think.
Thank you, Colin. I think it would be, I want to move into next more of a discussion about certain components of GREET, and I think some of the points that Patrick wanted to bring up will probably fit in there. But before we do, does anybody have any clarifying questions about kind of the two different accounting methods used in the Vermont greenhouse gas inventory and the clean heat standard? And while I wait for questions, I'll also just ask Colin to speak to, my understanding is that ANR is going to be doing this kind of supplemental upstream life cycle and assessment sort of supplement to the inventory on an ongoing basis. Is that correct? So like every year that'll be included as a supplement, or do you know?
Yes, our plan is to essentially use the framework that ERG has put together for this project that they just presented on, and essentially extend that out as year by year. So kind of add years to it and update the GREET kind of say back end as we go. And I'm not a GREET expert like Andrew and Ben are, so it's going to take some serious learning for me to kind of dig into the weeds of that. But I started to do that, and yes, that is the plan going forward.
Thank you.
Sure.
Any other clarifying questions for Colin? Dr. Cullenward?
Just a very quick question, and thank you for the presentation. I wanted to confirm to just get a sense of your understanding about whether out-of-state sequestration, so for example, growth in carbon in forests outside the state, whether that counts in the inventory, and if so, in sort of what line item or accounting mechanism. Thank you.
Sure. In our inventory, no. So it would not. I think the theory being that it would be accounted for in whatever state's inventory kind of that material had come from. And I think you get into some kind of really complicated accounting when you kind of, like for the life cycle landscape accounting, I think like where you account for certain things, I think is, as Andrew described a little bit of it, is it gets really complex in terms of who's accounting for what, but in the greenhouse gas inventory, no, anything out of state is not going to be captured in that respect.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, not seeing any other hands, I'm going to keep going. And this is where we're going to start to move more into the discussion portion of this GREET workshop. So what I've tried to do here, again, not, offering any like positions on these issues, but really just to facilitate a constructive discussion of the TAG. So identifying some of the key assumptions in GREET for which the method selected or the assumptions used can really influence the result. And so I think probably bear some discussion within the TAG. So I've listed some of those here. One of the things I would love to get feedback on is, are there other big ticket items, that we really need to work through as a tag or as the subgroup not on this list? I think we saw from the ERG presentation that avoided methane is a key question. Biogenic carbon dioxide. There's also a question about methane leakage that I wanted to raise. Avoided emissions from reduced electricity generation. That's an issue that TJ has been taking the lead on. So I don't have a slide on that, but our subsequent agenda item is going to get into that issue. And there are some, assumptions that would influence the emission impacts there. And for each of these topics, what this slide deck does is kind of just walk through, like, what is the issue? What does GREET assume as a default? What did ERG assume in their study? Are there other options? And then also, what are the implications for fully in-state pathways versus cross-border pathways? Because that's where there can be some differences, and also that's where some of the differences in accounting between the greenhouse gas inventory and the clean heat standard can come into play. So just for a little more background on that, again, and I am not an expert in this, so this is all material that I've been kind of learning in the past couple of months of being on the tag. But just a quick visual, I think this came up in the prior presentation, but the fully in-state pathway, both the feedstock and the combustion occur in Vermont, whereas the cross-border pathway, the combustion occurs in Vermont, but the feedstock of the fuel, the sourcing of the fuel, could occur out of state, related to the generation, the extraction, the production, the transportation, the distribution. At any of those stages could be out of state. And then the other term that I've had to learn, fuel pathway, maybe everybody else knows this term, but that is just a term that means what are the stages of a fuel's production and use. And it's used in the Clean Heat Standard law. It feeds into the carbon intensity value, the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. So this is just intended to make sure we all have a common understanding of terminology as we kind of move through this discussion. Okay. So we'll pick back right up with the avoided methane emissions discussion. And this is where I think it would be appropriate, Patrick, if you are interested in sharing some of your thoughts, but this is a big issue in terms of treatment of renewable natural gas, and should it be credited with emission reductions for the avoided methane emissions from landfill gas flaring and or manure treatment of animal waste, animal digesters. So default GREET, and I think that R&D GREET, like the off-the-shelf latest GREET, gives full credit for those emissions, although apparently there's also disclaimers about maybe this will change. The ERG study gives no credit for those avoided methane emissions. And then there are other options where you could have partial credit, but no carbon intensity scores. There also could be implications for fully in-state pathways versus cross-border pathways. Like, I could imagine us deciding, for instance, we should get credit for avoided, animal waste traditional treatment if it's a dairy in Vermont, but we shouldn't get credit if that renewable gas is coming from another state. That might be a position of the tag. So this feels to me like an area where the tag just needs to kind of discuss, see where we are, see what questions people have. And, again, we're not going to make decisions today, but eventually make some recommendations on how this should be treated. So, discussions. Patrick?
Yes, and sorry I had to step away for 2 minutes. Our firewood delivery just came and I had to make sure that it was getting put in the right place. So so what I guess I'd start with just a couple comments following from the ERG presentation and trying to put a couple of things in context. In GREET, or at least my understanding of GREET, is that avoided methane emissions don't, and this is how CARB does it, I believe Oregon does it, the accounting of the avoided methane emissions doesn't actually happen in GREET. It's something that happens outside of GREET. It is and then the results of the avoided methane emissions calculations are I'm simplifying massively here, but they're basically added to the results from the life cycle accounting of the fuel and from GREET. So there's sort of two separate components happening. And yeah, I think, and thanks, Andrew, I see your note there. I think what I'm trying to describe is that there can be much greater resolution of detail and much more accurate accounting. Like Andrew mentioned, GREET is quite coarse related to some of these things. And the way California does it is you get much more resolution of detail and accurate accounting if you take a methodology from outside GREET to handle the avoided methane calculations. So that's thing one. Thing two is, I don't know how many folks have been to dairy farms in Vermont or California or anywhere else in the summer, but you can actually see them when it's hot outside, you can actually see the methane bubbling out of the lagoons and going up into the atmosphere. In Vermont, that's typically in just the warm months. In other places, it would happen throughout the year. When manure lagoons are cold, you don't get as much methane producing activity. But what's significant is that in most states, coming out of each state's implementation of the Clean Air Act, farms of a certain size, and that can vary state to state, are required to manage their manure in lagoons of different shapes, sizes, and types that causes the methane. They're required to do this for water quality reasons. So for example, there's a requirement to have 180 days of manure storage so that in the winter, manure isn't getting spread on fields, running into waterways, and so on and so forth. So there are regulatory requirements that are causing this to happen. Then speaking to the California's choice or consideration of removing avoided methane emissions, that's, yes, still up for debate. California has proposed in draft LCFS amendments how they're going to handle it. And I should say it's still up for debate in the LCFS program. California has other programs that that credit avoided methane emissions. But my understanding of California's choice, consideration of and proposal to do away with avoided methane crediting in 2040 is that they are going to, what they're trying to and have been incentivizing is a change in the way manure management happens. And they think that it will take until around 2040 to cause that change to happen in the industry. So wanted to make that point. Lastly, Andrew brought up the question of allocating co-products, and that's a really big and important question that I think lots of jurisdictions haven't considered when dealing with avoided methane emissions. But if you're taking, since I'm focused on dairy, if you're taking, there have been some of the proposals to do away with avoided methane emissions seem to suggest that all of the impact of the methane should be attributed to the manure. Whereas if you got into allocation of products from a farm, historically, and I believe GREET treats manure as a waste product, so there would be no upstream emissions associated with it. That's a question people can consider and debate. But you would also have to consider what goes into producing them, what portion of the emissions should be attributed to producing the milk, the meat. Andrew brought up the hides, so on and so forth. So that is a whole intricate and complicated set of questions in life cycle assessment about which allocation method to use, economic allocation, energy allocation, so on and so forth, that I'm not aware of any jurisdiction that has done that yet, but is, yeah, just wanted to put it out there. Thank you.
Thank you. I was just, Rick, I didn't know if you wanted to jump in. I was just gonna move to Sam.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. Yes, Sam.
Thanks, Patrick. Thanks, Rick. Thanks, Emily. So we do a lot of work on this topic at the state, federal, and international level. And, you know, really what we see, the value we see in avoided methane crediting is that it's been a major policy tool to reduce methane emissions. And I'm happy to discuss why we think it makes sense. And you know, I think this is probably a good time to do that. But I'm wondering first, and you know, that includes, right, we have a lot to say on why and how this has worked in California to actually reduce pretty significant amount of emissions in the state through RNG. But I haven't heard anyone explicitly say, you know, in the tag that we shouldn't do avoided methane crediting. And so first, I just wanted to ask, is there a reason, is anyone, you know, suggesting that we shouldn't include avoided methane crediting as part of the RNG CI score? And it would be good to know why. And I think that would be helpful maybe to frame the conversation a little bit. And by all means, Rick, if Emily, if this is getting ahead of where we want this conversation to go, let me know. But I think that would be really helpful because you know, I just haven't heard that yet from the tag, right? Or any reasoning behind that.
I mean, I will say for myself, I'm still educating myself about this issue and I'm not sure. I do think from my initial review of some of what's going on in California that depending on how it's done, it could sort of turn a program like the Clean Heat Standard into a farm methane collection program, when really the point of the program is to reduce the thermal emissions in the state of Vermont. So I think there could be some trade-offs there. I will say I'm not quite sure what my viewpoint is, but I'm not 100% sure it should be full credit for avoided methanes, especially methane, especially if it's out of state methane. So I'll just out myself as one tag member that is not sure and at least wants to discuss it further. And maybe we'll go back to Patrick in a second, but I would ask Dr. Cullenword to weigh in because I think you've also looked at this issue and you probably have a couple of points to make, but maybe you could speak to, you know, what some of the reasons might be that you would want to at least limit it and not have negative carbon intensity scores.
Sure.
Thanks, Emily. And I'll come back if you don't mind after the rest of the folks have gone here and maybe just talk a little bit about what we've seen as the experience in California and why we think this is a positive thing to do.
Great. Yep.
Maybe 3 quick points from me. One, there might be policy reasons in terms of the goals of the policy that would favor some discussion of not doing fully avoided methane crediting. To give you an example from California, avoided methane crediting for biomethane projects, specifically for RNG, generates about 18% of the credit supply in California's multi-billion-dollar program. And it contributes far less than 1% of transportation fuels, which is the main thing the low carbon fuel standard is supposed to be doing. So to Emily's point, full avoided methane emissions crediting can lead to pretty distortionary outcomes where fuel pathways that have negative emissions by virtue of the fact that they're getting offset credits essentially can substantially outcompete other clean approaches. So that's one issue. A second issue, which I would encourage the tag to pay attention to, is for different kinds of projects and pathways. you might see the putative life cycle claims of avoided methane crediting not actually show up in the inventory as that inventory is constructed today in Vermont, and as it might be constructed in the future as ANR considers how to handle its upstream emissions accounting questions, as we heard about. So the second point I want to make here is that there are, I think, important connections between the choices that are made about how to assign life cycle scores and what benefits show up in the inventory as that inventory is constructed and as the inventory counts towards Vermont's overall climate emission reduction requirements. And the third point I want to make, just to throw it out there, a lot of talk is happening right now about what's happening in California. I'm based in California. I'm also the vice chair of the state's Oversight and Advisory Committee for Market-Based Programs. I'm happy to address any of the details of what's going on, but I think it's important for the TAG to know there's a pretty serious and contested debate about the future of the Low Carbon Fuel Standard program in California, and a lot of controversy around these specific issues, in part because about 2/3 of the biomethane from RNG is imported from out of state. So you have really important and difficult challenges around the emissions accounting, the politics, and the consistency with what state inventories record. And I particularly encourage the TAG to think about the connection between the choices it makes about the carbon intensity scores it assigns to different fuels and how the climate benefits of those fuels will show up in the state's inventory and count towards the state's emission reduction requirements. So I look forward to the conversation, and thank you.
So can we go to TJ next, just to get all the voices in first before we circle back?
Yeah, thanks. And I just want to make a point about what I think at least the TAG should be addressing here as it makes decisions. I heard in some of the last couple of comments that, well, we want to make a decision on what's counted because of policy result X. And I don't think that that is the role of the TAG, is to put our policy inclinations on the analysis. This technical group needs to describe the technical implications of decisions and the clean heat standard and what the implications might be, but not decide on how we're going to account on something because we think one result or another is better. That kind of policy discussion has already happened and in the development of Act 18 and will continue to happen once we can articulate the implications. But we can't, this is not the group to say, well, we think the policy should be something, and so we're going to, count something, in this way to make that policy happen. We are not a policy advisory group, we're a technical advisory group. And so as we go forward, that's my perspective and the department's perspective anyway, and I hope people keep that in mind, that we're not looking for a particular outcome here.
Appreciate that grounding. Sam, do we want to come back to you? Did you want to respond directly to Dr. Cullen Ward?
I'll let Patrick go first.
Okay.
Thanks. I mostly wanted to speak to Emily, your concern about avoided methane crediting leading to the CHS being I think the way you framed it was a farm methane collection program, and that to me sounds a lot like concern about perverse incentives or things like that. And I get it. I agree. I think about perverse incentives a lot. But I think what I wanted to put in perspective for everybody here was what I see as the practical realities of RNG production from dairy methane in Vermont, which honestly I see them to be quite low and quite small. There's a really small number of farms in the state that are big enough to support an RNG project. And there are people who have tried to do several times community scale projects where a group of 10 or 12 or 15 farms are all bringing manure to one digester or one digester facility. And that's really hard. And those have failed here because of that. And unless the price of carbon in the CHS program was so high, which is a whole separate complicated question, I know the tag's thinking about sort of indirectly. Unless that was the case, I would expect most, at least at the moment, most stereobiomethane that could be produced in Vermont to actually get shipped out of state. And so just wanted to put those things, share my perspective on that. Thanks.
Thank you. Go ahead, Sam.
Thanks, Patrick. That's a really important point. To just go back to, I think, you know, I'll just touch on why we think this is a good thing, right? And I think TJ's point on focusing on the technical implications, I think it's good. So we can just focus on the technical implications of avoided methane, right? So we know that we need to account for full upstream reductions and sources of emissions in the fuel life cycle under this program, right? So we see in the liquid biofuels category, there's land use change as part of that, right? One part of that, but part of that. Electricity-based technologies have upstream grid emissions, or, you know, perhaps emissions related to a PPA, which would give it a different CI. I think that's a decision that still has to be made. None of those interactions will fall into Vermont's thermal sector emissions ultimately. So I think, you know, from our perspective, we just really view this as a fundamental part of what biogas does in the environment, and that it should be treated similarly. And really what this comes down to, and again, to the real implications of what this will do for the fuels procured under the program and the fuels that are produced more broadly, whether inside or outside of Vermont, is that avoided methane crediting allows the buyers to select for the most impactful RNG sources, right? And therefore to affect the greatest amount of greenhouse gas reductions. So in our view, I think, you know, we don't want to forego the ability to reduce methane emissions or other helpful upstream interactions. And if you get rid of methane crediting, you'd basically treat RNG from a landfill similar to that which is derived from, say, a dairy, right? The big difference there is with a dairy, and, you know, we mentioned earlier in the meeting some highly negative carbon intensity scores. Those methane reductions have a majorly outsized impact on the environment, right? Whether it occurs within Vermont or outside of Vermont, we know that different interactions related to these fuels occur inside and outside of Vermont. But the reality is you're reducing a significant amount of emissions related to that unit of fuel. That's not necessarily the case with landfill gas. Now, there's still benefits to using landfill gas, but they would typically flare it otherwise. So I think the main point here, right, is if the goal of the program is to reduce emissions and to incentivize the most impactful versions of each fuel first, then for RNG, avoided methane crediting is really the best way to do that. So I think, you know, if the goal of the program is to reduce emissions, including avoided methane crediting, will accomplish that to a greater degree. There's no doubt about that. Both inside and outside of the thermal sector, which is what we're explicitly worried about here, right? And I think if we're going to get rid of that concept for the clean heat standard, as opposed to, you know, the fact that it is included in not just California's LCFS, but as Patrick mentioned, other programs in California and other programs in Oregon, Washington, right? I believe Minnesota will include avoided methane crediting. There's frameworks under the greenhouse gas protocol to do this too, right? If we're going to just get rid of that, then I think it has to be for a legitimate reason and not just to lessen the impact of biofuels under the program. So hopefully that's helpful. I think that's generally our viewpoint. Happy to answer questions if you have any.
Yeah, and I know we have to move on to, because we're already behind schedule and need to kind of keep it moving. I have one clarifying question, then maybe we'll go to Danny for one more follow-up, and then I think this has at least been helpful in illuminating the range of this topic and giving us a better understanding. My question is for if there is a Vermont dairy that is able to set up a biomethane operation and produce this RNG for the Clean Heat Standard program, the combustion from the RNG would be counted in the thermal sector if it's being used in building equipment. What is the avoided methane part? Like, is that going to show up in a different sector? This is an inventory question. Like, where does that show up in the Vermont inventory? Because that's not all in the RCI sector, right? That would be in like the agricultural sector.
Yeah, it would show up as a reduction in the ag sector or whatever sector you include the methane emissions from that dairy in currently.
Yeah, okay. So if it was an out-of-state dairy, it's not going to show up in the inventory at all, even if we influence that and make it better. If it's an in-state dairy, it shows up in another sector. And then, just the combustion piece shows up in the RCI sector. So I think this just also illuminates the complexity of these two accounting methods and how we're going to have to come up with kind of factors to translate between them. Dr. Cullenward?
I just wanted to touch on that same issue very briefly. Again, I would encourage the TAG to think about how these choices will be reflected and recorded in the inventory. And I think I heard the previous commenters, I think it was Patrick, who said that, if we're not expecting a lot of biogas production in Vermont, that implies you get a situation very similar to what's in California, where the majority of the RNG that gets credited is from outside the state. And if that's the case, do any of those putative climate benefits even show up in the inventory? Do they count? The reason this matters is GREET, this tool we're talking about, is agnostic as to the location and nature of the climate benefits that it calculates. And the question we're really trying to get at here is how the assignment of carbon intensity scores, which is being contemplated through the use of the GREET modeling tool, can be reconciled with the state's inventory. And I think that's an important technical question about what the options are and what the consequences are. That is a technical issue that needs to be worked through, because GREET essentially is sort of agnostic to those questions, and therefore the results it produces with default assumptions may or may not be consistent with any particular legal or policy framework. And again, as I understand the statutory framework for this program, it's intended to be consistent with the Vermont inventory, which is why I'm encouraging a discussion about how these accounting choices in the modeling tool manifest in terms of the results that would show up, particularly if you're looking at a situation where most of the RNG would be coming from outside the state, which I think has particular implications for those benefits not actually being recorded in the inventory, at least is what I'm hearing the inventory is doing right now. Thank you.
Hey, Emily, I know we need to move on, but I really important question, I think, in response there is, if we're looking at where different life cycle scored energy resources fall within and outside of the state level inventory, how then are we treating upstream emissions that aren't methane avoidances, right, from other RNG, electricity, and biofuel sources? I mean, those are also out of state sources of emissions that will be included in the program in the LCA model. So I guess I'm just curious, like, I understand if we were trying to reconcile this exactly with the state inventory, but I don't think we are, because you can't do that when your life cycle scoring resources that are coming from out of the state, whether that's electricity, whether it's biodiesel that's produced out of state, or whether it's other sources of RNG, forget avoided methane crediting, like landfill gas, which have some sort of a positive upstream CI aspect that come out of state. So I would just encourage folks to think about that when we're thinking about congruency between in-state versus out-of-state emissions and how we will ultimately have to reconcile that with the state's inventory.
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point, that RNG is certainly not alone in having those reconciliation issues. And I do have a couple more slides, but Catherine, do you want to do a checkpoint?
Yeah, so we had allotted an hour. We didn't get a full hour for this discussion. We have time at the end for breakout groups, but if we want to continue along this discussion, I think we have to decide now whether we want to just dismiss the breakout groups and have them between meetings, or Rick, if you have another proposal, but we just need to decide as a group how we want to spend the rest of the time.
Yeah, I would strongly suggest, and of course the TAG can make a different decision, that we cut off here, stick with our schedule, and allot time in our next meeting and meetings to take on the other discussion points. There are at least two other issues that Emily's and Colin's slides have raised that we want to touch on. Unless we think that we're going to get to all of them, in the remaining time and want to go through it, I mean, that would be the choice of the TAG. But I think that this discussion it's going to continue. We still haven't gotten output from the consultants, so we have time and leisure to take on the subject matter in the coming meetings. That would be my preferred approach.
Just for clarification, is Opinion Dynamics going to be presenting to us, I believe, at the next meeting on their measures characteristics? So that will be the time when some of these issues will be raised again. Is that right?
That is true. And yes, that is true. But the purpose of this discussion has still been educational. We want to continue that. So even if Opinion Dynamics were not to present at the next meeting, it would still be of, I think, high value to continue this discussion then as well. Again, it's up to the TAG if we want to, undo and just use the rest of this time to continue this discussion and not touch on the other points that we have set in the.
Well, I was suggesting that we take the breakout time off the agenda, and then allow them to meet in between the meetings so that they still have that opportunity. So that's one other alternative. Emily, do you have a point of view, or does others have a point of view? Yeah, Brian.
Yeah, thanks. So I posted in the chat some excerpts from Act 18 about what its goal is. Relevant to this particular discussion, I think it's really important to level set on, what the Act says we're trying to do and how. I don't see how to advance this biomass energy discussion related to RNG or solid biomass until and unless there's a common understanding of what the Act is requiring. And I think it's pretty straightforward.
So are you suggesting, Brian, that we should, I'm not sure why there's so much feedback, that we should take some more time for this discussion and skip the breakouts? Because I think you raised a really good point, and I would love to dive into those, but are you suggesting that, just what is your time management recommendation?
Well, I
also
think,
just say, if you think it's very straightforward, maybe just say it, and that would be.
well, I think it's, if there's a difference of opinion about what the goal of the Act is, it makes the conversation in the biomass energy group really difficult.
Emily, did you have a point of view about time management yourself? And I think we need to make that decision before we go any further.
I mean, my own preference is to stay with this discussion. So I disagree with Rick, I guess, because I think this is really helpful for framing, and we have several key people missing. Like Ken is not here for bioenergy. Pacing subgroup already has an off meeting scheduled, and we're missing Deirdre today. And also selfishly, I'm not sure I can be at the next meeting. So in terms of my own ability to continue to kind of walk through these slides, I'm not sure if that can happen. So for those reasons, I prefer to skip the subgroups, but I would totally defer to the group.
Well, we have a couple of folks agreeing with you, TJ and Luce in the chat. Others want to raise a point of view so we can make this decision and continue. Anybody have an objection for us getting rid of the breakout groups? Patrick?
Yeah, I would just say the bioenergy breakout group could, I'm not sure there's much of an agenda. We could basically continue the discussion there. And I'm not on the pacing group. I don't know if they have things to discuss today, but that's all.
So you're okay with we got rid of the breakout groups today and had them later? Is that the conclusion?
I'm saying if we had the breakout groups today, the discussion could be continued in the bioenergy breakout group, because we're essentially having a bioenergy discussion.
Right, which had been part of our thought. Look, I'm easy either way. I mean, if but let's continue. I just want to remind us that we have at least two other areas of subject matter areas to talk about that were raised in the slides. Is the intention to go through those, or are we going to continue specifically on this question of RNG and landfill emissions?
So my recommendation would be to move forward and also allow some time for Brian to walk us through his topic of what we're really trying to accomplish, or what the Clean Heat Standard law says we're trying to accomplish. I think, the intent was not to arrive at any final decisions, but just to kind of have a pretty comprehensive framing of the issue. And then my thinking is that once we've done this kind of framing of the issue, making sure the full tag has a common framework and sort of understands the scope of the decisions before us, then the bioenergy subgroup can go off and develop initial recommendations to bring back to the subgroup. So I guess that's my thought process.
And let me just ask Michelle. Michelle, you're leading the pacing group. Would you be able to add additional time to your breakout session later next week?
Yes, thank you, Catherine. I was frantically typing into the chat there. We'll have even more material that we were planning to discuss. We'll be better prepared for our full discussions next week and better able to digest the straw proposal that came out. So I believe I speak for the group. We're fine with skipping the breakout session today.
Okay. Well, I'm hearing generally an agreement with that approach. And let's just clarify, as Emily has pointed out and as Rick has pointed out, we're not trying to make decisions. So I think once a point has been made and a perspective has been shared, we don't need to continue to debate it. I think the idea, as Rick said, is just to surface different perspectives today. And so that the rest of the tag that's maybe not as steeped in this has an understanding what those perspectives are. With that, Emily, I'll turn it back to you, and let's assume that we're going to try to stay on schedule, or take the 30 minutes we had for the breakout groups to finish this up.
Well, that would give us till 10 of 12. Is that what you have in mind, Catherine?
Well, we've already kind of used up a bunch of it in just this discussion alone. So I think we only have about, if we can get to the public comment in the next 20 minutes, that would be great.
Okay.
Okay, let's forge ahead. Brian, I appreciate what I did want to divert because I think you're raising an important point, but could you just talk us through the implications of that? Like, are you sensing what I'm reading between the lines of your comment, that are you sensing that we're like deviating from what's written into the Clean Heat Standard legislation, or could you just kind of walk us through your point more explicitly?
I don't have a point. I thought I heard Sam raise a question about what the goal of the program was. And the program goal is explicit in the act.
Does anyone have any reaction to that or any questions? Does it seem straightforward? Are we all in agreement based on what Brian has pasted in the chat?
I just like, Brian, could you say in sort of plain, I mean, I've read what you put in the chat and thank you for putting it there, but have you just say what you think that goal is in sort of more plain language?
I don't know how to be more plain than retiring the amount of clean heat credits to meet the thermal sector portion of the greenhouse gas emissions reduction obligations of the Global Warming Solutions Act. And as Colin explained, as measured by the inventory methodology.
Okay, Emily, you want to
Yeah.
keep through these?
Yeah, I do think that I was just reflecting that there is a fundamental contradiction there, because if they really wanted us to just focus on the thermal portion of the greenhouse gas inventory, then they might not have gone out of their way to include this life cycle analysis method. So what we're left with is we have to account for the life cycle impacts, but then they aren't actually reflected in the ledger where we're going to see the results in a lot of cases, which is a little weird.
I didn't say it was elegant. I just said, this is what it says.
Yeah.
So let's go to the last, see if we can cover the last two issues
Yeah.
in 15 minutes.
TJ, you looked like you were about to jump in.
I'll hold my comment. Thanks.
Okay. Okay, well, back to the deck. I'm going to just move to the next issue. Also, not something we're going to, hang on, resolve, but another really important kind of discussion point is this biogenic carbon dioxide emissions piece, which I think ERG did a great job kind of explaining, and Colin as well, explaining this issue, but the accounting of biogenic carbon dioxide emissions, so emissions from combustion of biogenic fuels, and that includes wooden pellets, but also other biogenic fuels like ethanol and biodiesel. How those are counted, they are sometimes addressed for in these like land use flux in another part of the inventory. Default GREET is to exclude these emissions, kind of assuming they're kind of netted out over the lifetime of the measures, I think. So zero greenhouse gas emissions associated with combustion of biogenic fuels in default GREET. ERG actually reported the results two ways, which I thought was really helpful, both with and without those emissions. You could imagine kind of hybrid approaches where you exclude it for in-state projects where, we do know we have the Vermont forests, which are net sink. So maybe even though they're not showing up we could sort of agree to let that go. But then what about out-of-state feedstocks, which are being combusted in Vermont, presumably actually producing greenhouse gas emissions from that combustion in Vermont? And then whatever fluxes in the land use are happening could be occurring out of state. So this is another one where we could potentially make different choices for in-state pathways versus cross-border pathways. And I'm not sure where to draw the line between what's a technical decision and what's a policy decision. Here, TJ, to your earlier point, but I think that's that's my framing. And now I would just invite some initial comments. Dr. Cullenward.
Thank you. I think this is, again, a similar set of issues where reconciliation with what's in the inventory is really important. And to Brian Wood's comment earlier about what's in the statutory charge, I think it's interesting to me because some of it's about what's in the thermal sector and some of it's about what's in the Vermont inventory. And as with the avoided methane emissions questions, there's a cross-border accounting issue here involving the land sector. And the standard rationale that's offered in inventory guidance around why you don't include biogenic CO2 emissions, say in the energy sector or the thermal sector, is because those would be properly accounted for in the standard guidance in the land sector. And so where you have everything within a single state project that that logic and that accounting can, I think, make consistent sense. It's a little bit harder, arguably, with the cross-border implications. And so I just wanted to toss out, to me, this has some very similar challenges, and to connect it to the statutory mission, it's a question of what you count in the thermal sector, as well as what you count in the state's overall greenhouse gas inventory. Thanks for the time.
Ryan, I don't know. I'm sorry, I wasn't looking, so I didn't see whose hand was up front first. It was Sam. Sam.
Thanks. I'll cede to Brian first.
You're too kind. Just clarifying, the act reads that the reductions are in the thermal sector are going to be consistent to achieve the reductions in the thermal sector. So the Climate Council has determined that they have an anchor year of 2018 that determines the percentage of the state's total greenhouse gas emissions from each sector. And the act says that those the emissions reductions need to be proportional. So Act 18 is attempting to, it directs establishment of this clean heat standard program and a clean heat credit budget that results in emissions reductions in the thermal sector only, consistent with the reductions that are called for in the Global Warming Solutions Act, which requires these proportional reductions by sector. So we have to achieve these particular emission reductions. Every sector is required by the Global Warming Solutions Act to reduce by the same percentage. So no sector is carrying more or less of the requirement. And then the clean heat standard is specific to the thermal sector, not to the entire act.
Sam?
Thanks. So I guess first, just a callback to Floyd's presentation, where I think he covered this issue in particular pretty comprehensively. So maybe it's worth, I know I will go back and revisit some of his slides when thinking through this. When we're talking about the biogenic CO2 emissions piece, right? To me, the default GREET methodology and the ERG ANR study methodology, follow what I know to be all of the major greenhouse gas accounting bodies' position on this, right? Including IPCC, EPA, WRI, and every other state except for one in the US that I'm aware of, which is that you would just record the biogenic CO2 separately from the sector where it's emitted in the inventory. And I think, again, this is one where if there's a reason to deviate from that, I think it's worth a discussion. But absent some other very compelling carbon accounting body or some reason that Vermont would want to deviate from what other states are doing, which I think the really important consideration there is the market distortion that this would cause. So essentially, right, if you're not counting, for example, for biodiesel, if you're counting the CO2 emissions the same as fossil CO2 emissions, I mean, you're basically just removing all of the positive impact from that fuel under the program. Same for RNG and for other bioenergy sources. If there's not a compelling reason to do that, I mean, I don't see why this program wouldn't just follow what everyone else is doing. And I know that WRI just did an update to their greenhouse gas protocol in the past 2 years to the land use sector, which actually included, a new consideration around how to, whether or not you should include biogenic CO2 emissions in what would be scope 1, right? In this case, the thermal sector. And it's remaining the same as it's always been done. So this is a pretty long-standing one, but just wanted to throw that out there. I imagine other folks in the bioenergy sector similarly feel strongly that this is a pretty settled piece, but of course always always interested in hearing if there's debate or compelling reasons otherwise.
One specific, I don't know if this is a compelling reason, but question that comes up for me with respect to this is that the Vermont Clean Heat Standard law does identify advanced wood heat as a potential clean heat measure. And so I think, I'm still trying to wrap my head around this, but I think that means that the greenhouse gas emissions from wood would not be included or counted, but then you could have a clean heat measure that would, be presumably, I guess we would get to count them from switching from a fossil fuel. It just seems like a little weird to me that they're sort of counted in one place and not another. I don't know if others understand this issue better and want to weigh in. And I also see Andrew had his hand come up, so maybe go to Andrew and then Brian.
Hello again. Yeah, quick clarification and then a question. Biogenic CO2 in GREET is handled a bit inconsistently, or in some places it is assumed, especially for kind of short rotation biofuel feedstocks, that they are essentially carbon neutral. There is no soil organic carbon accounting, or at least there's no sophisticated soil organic carbon accounting occurring within GREET. That's also kind of assumed away as just being neutral overall. But yeah, some pathways are just assuming, based on, they're assuming that there's no equilibrium shift in the carbon stored on the landscape, or no large fluctuation with the harvest of biofuel feedstocks, and that leads to assumption of biogenic carbon neutrality for a lot of the biofuels. But there are biogenic CO2 emissions profiles over time that are characterized on the woody tab and used to some extent on the bioelectricity tab in order to inform the biogenic CO2 emissions estimates for bioelectricity in different regions. That's the clarification, just based on what's on the slide. The question I have, and I think this kind of comes back to things that Brian Woods has been saying, is how is Vermont, how in terms of like reading this bill, how, and this might just be for my understanding, this might be a kind of another kernel of confusion for folks here. How do we reconcile the difference between the explicit statement that there are targets focused on the thermal sector for reducing total emissions over time, but that the credits are assigned based on life cycle carbon intensities, which will not naturally all come from what are classified as thermal sector emissions in like a full inventory framework?
That's the $64,000 question, Andrew.
Our budget's bigger than that, isn't it, Rick?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to suggest that Brian, who has his hand up, will answer and solve that for us.
I don't have, that's the job of the tag, to do exactly that reconciliation. I just want to be explicit. We're not discussing changing the inventory methodology. Right now, in the inventory methodology, it's direct combustion emissions from thermal fuels, and biofuels count as zero in that sector. That emissions from biofuels, from RNG, what little we were using, from cordwood pellets, those all would show up in the land use and land use change sector for fuels sourced in Vermont, and they would not show up anywhere. They would show up in the state where we source the fuels if they were coming from someplace else, but they do not appear in the thermal sector. So, but in the greenhouse, in the clean heat standard world, you earn credits based upon the life cycle emissions of the fuel that's avoided, which is fossil fuel minus the life cycle emissions of the fuel that's used instead. So you are,
which is zero.
well, it depends on what fuel you're
Well,
talking
I
about.
mean, if it's biomass, if it's wood.
Well, that's the discussion that
Yeah.
that we're having now. Is it are little in the ERG analysis, just looking at upstream, and I'm not suggesting that we use this methodology for the clean heat standard. This is simply an example. All right. And then, but using their upstream numbers for firewood, for cordwood, then the emissions from the clean heat credits would be, if you replace an oil burner furnace with advanced wood heat, pellet stove, you'd be avoiding the emissions from the combustion of fuel oil. So that's your clean heat credit. And then you back out the emissions, the life cycle emissions upstream and combustion from the fuel that's used instead. That's biofuels. That would be the wood. But in the inventory, you wouldn't see, it would earn that number of credits, but in the inventory, you would just see the fossil fuel emissions go away. And depending upon what clean heat measure substitutes for what emitting measure is, you're going to earn a different number of credits. And that's the discussion that we're having now. For clean heat measures, and basically the fuels that are clean heat measures, because even for measures, and the way, even though credits are allotted over a period of time for measures, the calculation ultimately comes down to the life cycle emissions of the fuel use avoided minus the life cycle emissions that the fuel is used instead. So the job of the tag is to say, what is the life cycle emissions? How are we going to score each of the fuels for each of the clean heat measures? And once we do that, how do you decide what the clean heat credit budget is for all the years, but particularly for the compliance years, that results in emission reductions in the thermal sector that achieve the Global Warming Solutions Act requirements? That's what our job is.
Yep.
Yeah. The line in the act where Vermont's pace sufficient for Vermont's thermal sector to achieve life cycle CO2e emissions reductions. Isn't that just a paradox? That's two different boundaries. It's like the thermal sector will only naturally be a subset of those life cycle emissions. How would the thermal sector achieve them?
Yeah. Well, I think we should keep moving since we've got our finger on the challenge before us, and I think there are some paradoxes embedded in that. But maybe we'll go to Sam, or unless Brian, did you have a follow-up immediately?
Oh, I think people have heard enough from me, don't you, Emily?
Never, Brian, but go ahead, Sam.
No, just, I think, thanks to Brian for bringing up the big point again, right? Which is that, we have to reconcile LCA with this data inventory. I think we've known that the bioenergy group identified that from the beginning, because I think a lot of us have some pre-existing experience, especially in the low carbon fuel standard programs where they've done this successfully for a pretty long time. And again, I'll point back to Floyd's presentation where he covered exactly how other states have handled this problem. And it's basically just keeping a separate set of books for the program and for the state level inventory. And that doesn't solve sort of the hard calculation of, how we need to estimate how many credits we expect to produce, say, per year based on the expected LCAs of each fuel, and then how you set the program trajectory based on that. That seems like a pretty hard question, but I think it's more clear that the way to handle is to keep the separate set of books, right? Because that's that's how other folks do it. And that's what, again, that was Floyd's presentation, which I thought was pretty helpful. So I'm going to revisit that one after this.
Patrick?
Yeah, thanks. To try and summarize a lot of things that we've been talking about today, and if our main task is to advise on technical aspects, not policy aspects. Policy has been written, has technical issues, and we suggest handling those technical issues in a different way. So for example, this piece that Brian put up here, instead of having it say shall be set at a pace sufficient for Vermont's thermal sector to achieve life cycle reductions, maybe it should just say at a pace sufficient for Vermont to achieve the goals of its Global Warming Solutions Act. Or that's, I'm sure, not quite right, but something along those lines. Like, we could provide that technical advice that says this policy so far has been written kind of wonky, and let's simplify it and clarify it. I think that would also speak to Emily, your point before about it being weird if wood was excluded, but advanced wood heating was included. I think that's our job, is to clarify when the policies have technical issues. So thanks.
So Emily, we have 5 more minutes if you want to cover the last issue, and we can still cover the remaining things that we have on our agenda besides the breakout groups. So up to you to how you want to.
Yeah, let's take a last comment from Dr. Cullenward, and then I think the last 2 slides I can wrap up really quickly.
I'll be very brief. I hope, if nothing else, this conversation has surfaced how the reconciliation questions are not simple. They're very important, but they're quite complicated. I keep hearing reference being made to how California has done this. No one has ever reconciled a life cycle approach to an inventory-based accounting target like this before. The jurisdictions that have programs like this, including California, simply have not reconciled, and they don't have a statutory mandate in the way that Brian has pointed out to achieve this outcome. Last point I want to make is, to the extent the policy process selects an outcome that credits a large number of activities that don't directly contribute, and the way that reconciliation is done is to increase the pacing of the program to require deeper reductions, because only a fraction of the credited reductions contribute to Vermont's goals, then that will impose higher costs on the people in Vermont who pay for the program to achieve that outcome. So appreciating that these are policy decisions, I think all of the technical issues have policy implications. And I wanted to flag that the standard approach of not reconciling this will require deeper and more expensive targets than one that is more limited in terms of what credits it offers, which has other implications for other stakeholders. And again, no one has done this before, to the best of my knowledge. This is the first process that has a statutory mandate to do this reconciliation.
Great. So we are leaders. One thing, just in kind of wrapping up this kind of reconciliation issue, which has also come up in the pacing subgroup, where we've, I think this reconciliation kind of transcends pacing and bioenergy. I do think it's helpful that we have this ANR study, this ERG study, and that if ANR decides to produce this supplement, if we were able to agree with ERG, either we're going to use all the same assumptions as they used, or going forward, we're going to use a set of assumptions that might be different, but we'll use it for this supplement in future years, then at least that would constitute like a separate ledger that we could then kind of translate the 2 sets of goals. So that's helpful, I guess. It seems helpful to me that there will be this supplement produced that, but it also, I think, speaks to the importance of, to the extent we can have all of these, like the ANR supplement and opinion dynamics and NV5 and the potential study kind of all operating off a similar set of assumptions, that seems useful as well. The last 2 slides I have, there's one more topic that I don't think we need to discuss, but would just flag. I don't think this is as much of like a policy choice, but just flagging that there could be places, and I would invite, if others are aware of other elements of GREET that might be in this category, but there could be places where we're not sure that GREET is using the latest science in its default assumptions. And one of those has to do with methane leakage. So not avoided methane, but the leakage from like production and pipelines of fuels, both fossil fuels and biofuels. And there has been a lot more science on this recently. And so this is one where ERG used the default GREET assumptions, but there is literature indicating that maybe the leakage rates are higher than what's reflected in GREET. I don't know that we need to discuss this specifically, but I guess it relates to kind of an overall recommendation of the tag on use of GREET, which is that you can customize GREET. We need to decide where we should customize and then ideally use those assumptions consistently everywhere. And that this is, I think, future conversation, but maybe just to tee this up for future consideration by the tag. I've heard Ken and others say that there seems to be some agreement that we probably will need to customize our own version of GREET, which is pretty easy to do by just like producing a different spreadsheet. There are some questions about what procedural mechanism, like is that adopted by a PUC order? Does it live on the PUC website? I think maybe the biggest question is, can there also be like further customization of GREET? Like, is everybody required to use this Vermont GREET, or could somebody proposing a specific project do further customization on what cycle is this, adopted? So I'm not sure we can have, I don't think we have time for a full discussion, but I just wanted to tee this up as like part of the decisions that the tag will need to make recommendations on, is sort of if there's anything we would like to recommend the PUC around use of GREET. Does anybody have a reaction to that, a short reaction to that, or question? Andrew?
Yeah. So yes, I do believe that we did not alter the default value. And when we say default values in GREET, we should probably just call them like as published defaults. They're not like default recommendations by the Argonne National Lab team or anything. But I do believe that we just left this the CH4 leakage rate selection in section 4.3 on the inputs tab as the as published default selection, which is trying to reconcile bottom-up estimates with top-down estimates. This is also that strain of trying to hybridize those two estimates is a very ongoing area of work in the LCA community. A lot of folks have kind of started to point to other sources of top-down estimates, such as I believe the organization is called Climate Trace, as a potential approach to getting better or more recent or like time series top-down estimates of methane leakage into inventory modeling. Potentially also could be incorporated into GREET. There is another option available within GREET to use EPA's, I don't know if it's their absolute most recent, but a fairly recent, like within the last 3 years, EPA put together some estimates. So that's also an option within GREET. But yeah, this is a pretty important set of parameters for the model, and definitely something that you will want to look into and tailorize for Vermont.
Patrick?
Yeah, can you flip to your last slide, Emily? I just wanted to say that I think the answer to the first 3 questions to me is or at least first 4 is pretty straightforward. Yes, Vermont should have its own version of GREET. The procedural mechanism, I don't know much about, but the PUC order seems like most likely. And then really for your where should the approved version of GREET be hosted? unless it was ANR, I would think it was the PUC. And since this is all a PUC regulation, I would think it should be the PUC. The last question I think is more complicated and is gonna require much further discussion. But just to cue that up for the future, if you take an LCFS model where each fuel pathway, where there is an option to use default fuel pathways, but also individual fuel pathway producers, developers, projects can propose their own, then they need the option to customize. Alternatively, if you take a US EPA renewable fuel standard model, which is different in a lot of ways, but analogous, EPA did their own life cycle assessments, basically has broad buckets of fuel categories that people can fit into to generate RINs. And there, individuals don't need their own ability to modify the GREET. There's lots of trade-offs. Floyd talked about some of them. They've come up before. In general, if you allow people to customize their own, then you incentivize innovation, which seems like a good thing to me, but that comes with a lot more complication involved in implementing the program, which I don't want to put Corey on the spot, but I'm sure she could speak to from her time in the Oregon Clean Fuel Standard. So thank you.
So let's go to Corey Ann now.
Hi, everybody. Good morning from Oregon. So I just wanted to, since I'm new here sitting in for Floyd for today, I just wanted to make sure everybody just has a little bit of background for me. Yes, I work for Clean Fuels Alliance America. Now I'm their state director of regulatory affairs for the West Coast. But yes, many of you know me as the previous program director for the Oregon Clean Fuels Program, which is Oregon's version of LCFS. So just to put that out there. I guess what was just said about the customization, I guess what I wanted to just say is that in this slide here, it says discussion customizing GREET. And I think what I wanted to just make clear about is like, say, for example, an Oregon GREET versus a California GREET. There are really just two things that are different. These are not fundamental differences in the accounting methods. It's really adjustments to account for Oregon's electricity grid versus California's, for example, or transportation distances for fuels to come to a different state, right? So whether I would say that it's a policy and a technical decision to align what those accounting methods are and what the approaches are, and that the base GREET model provides for it, right? So what I'm afraid that I'm hearing more of in this conversation is policy choices, leading to customization of GREET, as opposed to are there technical reasons why a Vermont GREET would be different than another version of GREET. And I think what I've told other states that don't have a standard regulation yet, right, is that the Argonne GREET model is a great way, a great beginning step to actually just to get into the right space of, what the carbon intensities are, what the policy impacts would be, But once you do get to a regulation point, it does matter, what choices you make in customizing your GREET. And so, like to this first question, should Vermont customize its own version? Yes, because you have a regulation, but what pieces of GREET are really open to discussion about the customization. And again, make sure that it's on a technical basis, not on a policy basis. You can handle the policy, aspects of it in outside of the actual GREET model. That's all I wanted to add.
Andrew, did you have a final comment?
Oh, I'm sorry. My hand is still up. No, I don't.
Great. I think we should wrap up there. I guess the one other, I'm just going to flip back for a second. I know TJ's got a brief update on the electricity generation assumptions and, you know, marginal versus average emission factors and things like that. That's another area. And I would just flag, and maybe this is for folks to think about for the next meeting, if there are other kind of areas within GREET, like key assumptions, things that you think the TAG should discuss or the bioenergy subgroup should discuss other than what's on this list. I just want to reiterate that this was not intended to be exhaustive of every possible area that might be worthy of discussion. It was just sort of what seemed like some of the bigger ticket items would be. So if others would like to propose other areas that we should discuss, you know, we could certainly do that on future meetings. And with that, I think we'll close this part of the discussion. I know for me, this has been illuminating, even though I think we've just decided that this is all going to be really hard and the legislation is confusing. But I'll stop screen sharing and turn it back over to Catherine or Rick.
I think we have another decision point here. We can take a break and come back for one public comment period since we got rid of the breakout groups. Or we can skip our break and keep moving and just finish up with the last two issues, the TJ's emissions profile for the grid and the equity advisory group report.
I would say let's skip our break at this point. We only have a half an hour left.
Yeah, we could do a 5-minute break, but also willing to just keep moving since we only have 30 minutes left. So if that's the case, TJ, you're up.
Yeah, this can be really brief. Just you recall last time we had discussions on how to account for grid emissions, whether it was the short-term marginal emissions as really was originally presented or a long-run approach. And what the department has directed NV5 to look at is as using the Vermont portfolio as a proxy for long-run marginal emissions. Now, as it relates to the conversation we just had, we're still considering how that translates into life cycle emissions. So that's the first part is going to immediately say GWSA, greenhouse gas inventory reporting. As it translates to life cycle emissions, that necessitates an estimate of the portfolio in the future and what sources you're actually getting. And so we're still working on that, different types of renewables, and then what is the remaining grid mix that is non-renewable, if there is any. And the last point I want to make is as we're considering this, we're considering also, as we do in a lot of things, the amount of work to get to kind of the 100% precision level, to get to perfect precision as related to the amount of work to get 95% of the way there. That last 5% is really the bulk of the work, and it may not provide that much additional value. So it's just a consideration we have, and that's really the update. I'm not sure how much more discussion folks want to know.
That's
I
great.
understand that there have been discussions between NV5 and Opinion Dynamics on this issue as well, right? So they are in communication.
That's right.
Any other clarifying questions for TJ at this point? Okay. Emily.
TJ, am I misremembering that at some point Opinion Dynamics mentioned like a statement of work with NV5? Is that statement of work still going to happen and or shared with the TAG?
So yes, they are working on that, and my understanding is that it'll be a public document that we share with the TAG.
Thank you.
All right. Then that brings us to Matt and Emily Roscoe again about the EAG and any updates on that front. Then we'll go to public comment.
I have a really quick update. The EAG has begun to fill out an outline of our first draft report. So really just getting started. They also sent a list of questions that the EAG recommend the Public Utilities Commission ask during future public engagement with Curtis Reed Jr. And then we also talked about EAG and TAG communication between the two groups, primarily how we can edit the rubric that we shared with the TAG a couple of meetings ago to best help the TAG and the PUC in decision making. So we agreed there will be additional language added in the instructions part, as well as some other edits to just help clarify this rubric's use, and that's coming. And then another part of this discussion was thinking about what it means if the TAG and the EAG have differing comments or recommendations. And a couple members of the EAG felt uneasy about this, while others felt this was okay and even important that there are different things coming out of each group. So, Matt, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
Rick has a question while we're waiting. If Matt's either trying to unmute or may have.
Emily, that last point you made, was that with respect to, say, maybe you said it, I just missed it, with the positions of the two groups on, say, credit ownership?
I think that discussion definitely came out of doing like a high level comparison of the two memos, but I think in general the discussion was more high level about, like, in the future, if we have differing recommendations, what does that mean? Is that good or bad? And we didn't come to any really clear conclusions, other than most agreed that that's probably a fine thing as each group is running in parallel. Yeah.
And I would agree with that too, because the PUC is the decision maker ultimately. Yeah. To the extent that we can achieve some alignment, terrific. But yeah.
Any other questions for our EAG liaisons? Yeah, Dominic?
I just wanted to pop in to expand on what Emily said about an updated rubric. That is being, the EAG took a vote, and Chris Trombley of the EAG is working to put those final touches on it. And then that rubric will be updated on our public facing website and communicated explicitly through myself to TAG. So when that is ready, it will show up officially in front of the TAG with encouragement for use.
Great, thank you. Matt, I see you're back.
No, I'm sorry, I had to step away. I'm sure Emily did a great job covering the EAG. The only important point that I wanted to make is that there is a robust discussion about how to handle the fact that in many of the LMI communities, there are renters, and there's a different economic incentive structure or clean heat measures when one is a renter, and how to address that. That was, I thought, a very important discussion, but certainly unresolved because it's been a wicked problem for a long time for those of us in this space. That's all. Thank you.
Thanks for the addition. All right, well, we now have a good 10 minutes to 15 minutes for public comment. And I'm consolidating the two comment periods we had. So if individuals that are from the public would like to raise your hand to indicate that you'd like to make a comment, and then we will call on you as the hands go up. There's someone on the phone, the number being ending in 603. Is that right? You identify yourself?
Hello, thank you. This is Thomas Weiss.
Hi, Thomas.
And I have two comments on availability of documents. The first is, how does one get the workbook that accompanies the ERG report? And the second is that I believe that chat is not available on the YouTube recordings, so that for example, someone put links in chat today on various statute sections, and I believe they're not available to later viewers on YouTube. I don't always attend these meetings live, and sometimes I view them on YouTube. So if links are not available, then the later viewers are missing something important. So those are my 2 comments.
Thanks. I'm not sure we can solve the YouTube recording problem, but we could capture those links and have them transcribed into the minutes. And that would give you access via the minutes. So any links that are shared, we wouldn't want to have to capture the entire chat, but links to documents and that type of thing, we could definitely transcribe into the minutes.
That would be,
that sounds suitable to me.
That would be good, the way you've described it, Catherine, because as we've said before, the chat is not something that we rely on for our discussion, other than the links to documents. So that'd be great.
Right. And then the other question, maybe for Brian, maybe if Colin is still there, is the workbook and is the report available on the ANR site, or, as I said, how does one get the workbook that has all the detailed numbers that went into the ERG report?
I'm looking to see if Colin is still on. Andrew is still on from ERG. We have those workbooks. They're actually linked workbooks that I'm actually having a problem making them work on my end, which is why we can't post them. They're macro enabled and multiple workbooks that are linked to each other. We can share them as soon as we work out that technical issue.
The links being.
Oops, sorry. But thank you for letting me know that.
The links you're referring to, Brian, are in the ERG report?
No, there's multiple Excel workbooks that work together, and they are linked. And when I tried to run them, I broke the links somehow, and we're trying to work internally to make sure that even I can view them all without references that go to nowhere. And
okay.
And then we need to work out how we would share either those linked workbooks or some subset of the information, maybe just the summary materials, like emission factors and the emission results to the public. But we can't do it now because I can't even really do it. It's a technical issue that I'll work with Colin and hopefully with ERG on.
All right, thanks for the clarification. Are there other comments from the public? Questions, follow-up questions from our presentations, which were quite detailed. All right. Well, with that then, Rick, you have the wrap up.
Wow. We're going to end early. That's surprising, but good. If no one has any other comments, I want to say that this was a terrific discussion, and I want to thank in particular Emily for framing it, and Colin for your assistance there, and Catherine, as always, for your wonderful facilitation. We will get together, Emily and Catherine and I, and obviously work out an agenda for the next meeting. But if there's anything in particular that folks want to, as I say, in particular, want to focus on, please let us know as soon as possible. Obviously, we're going to have some work around pacing and we'll need breakout sessions, I think, as well. And we're going to be hearing from Opinion Dynamics. So I think we'll have a meaty agenda as always. But please get in touch with us if you think there's anything we should focus on in particular. If there are no other comments, again, I want to thank everyone for a terrific discussion, to thank our experts who joined us. That was much appreciated. And again, to Emily and Catherine and Colin, and to Andrew and Ben, special thanks for really making this a very productive and informative meeting. So thank you, and have a nice weekend.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all. Take care.